Hey guys, it's Tom. Today I'm going to try something different and walking you through from blank paper to finished painting a completely imaginary subject. Which means, of course, this is something that doesn't exist, but just something that I made up. But I think, like all of us, our imaginations are very useful tools, but I think of mine as sort of a library, a lending library. So we go through life, through time, and different places we consciously or unconsciously, I think, store away inside of a visual library of imagery and patterns and compositions and shapes and colors from which we draw on. Whether we know it or not, I think we do this. What I'm always trying to do, what I'm really trying to do over especially this past year is dig deep into that library and pull out things that I knew were there but I haven't paid attention to, and try to become conscious of things that I may have overlooked before, that may be just lurking in there, but could wind up being very useful tools for the design and completion of, hopefully, some good paintings. So what I often start out with when I start to think about doing a painting is a pattern. This came to mind as often, in my case, I think in most of our cases, in a dream. I saw this pattern. It's not a thing, it's not a representational object, but it was a pattern of shapes and values. I saw this light field and this sort of offset cruciform shape. Pretty much just like that. As I do at home, I jotted this down, even worse than this, in a little sketchbook by my bed. And I looked through those in the days and weeks following, and sometimes you can take these little doodles and make something out of them. So this is one I thought, why did I think of this shape? What's going on? The first thing that sort of came to mind was memories of large bridges. I'm a massive fan of bridges. Anyway, I love the structure of them, the man-made aspects, of course, but I love the narrative of a bridge, the idea of transition, crossing from one place to another place. So I started to just play around in my mind at first, and now I'm going to do it here, live in my little sketchbook. This sort of reminded me of the feeling or this actual scene you might get if you're walking under a large bridge and you look up and you become very aware of this, the undercarriage, the structure of the bridge. But there's something to me really compelling about that. All this life that's happening up above the eye level, up above the street level. So I started to think, there's something here I could make into a painting. I'm sure there's a lot of things that any number of people could make into a painting. You could look through your reference photos or your memory banks and probably come up with photographs you've taken of actual bridges or buildings or something that represent this sort of compositional idea. But I love the idea of a bridge, but I wanted something even a bit more fanciful. So I started to think of imagery, again, where all the activity is up at the top of the image and it fades out as it comes up. I started thinking, therefore, of a composition, a vertical composition, where you would pull the information, the eye of the viewer, from the bottom up to the top. Lift the eye, lift the spirit of the viewer from the ground plane to the sky in a way, but anyway, up. The feeling you get from this, I think, can be many. One of them, I think, can be a sense of hope or optimism or mystery or expectation. When you look up at something, you get that feeling of, it can be a feeling of awe or inspiration or, again, hope or aspiration. So then I started thinking, what can I do with that rather than just a more typical view of the bridge, which would be perfectly fine. I've been thinking a lot lately about life in the cities. I'm obsessed with cities and urban life and why people crowd together to live in cities given the options. That's another topic, but I am a big fan of communal living. I think people come together to live in cities for all kinds of reasons, but no less so the idea that that's where a collection of thoughts and inspirations and ideas can collide to create better ones. There's obviously a lot of downsides of living in a city too, and I'm not ignorant of those. But as in all things, there's good and there's bad, and hopefully, on balance, the bad outweighs the good. So I thought, what can I do with this idea in terms of cities? For those of you who have listened to me blather over the years about what it is I look for in a painting or what I'm always striving for, you know that one thing, the primary recurrent theme in my work is that of contrast. Opposite things colliding on the surface of the paper to make something else. And to find resolution between perhaps two opposites. So dark meets light, vertical meets horizontal, in terms of color, warm versus cool, hot versus cold, and then more narrative things. Like I say, stasis and transition, and then in terms perhaps of time, the present and the future, or even the past and the future. If you like to play around with imaginary subjects, as I do, wow, the palette is very broad for these kinds of things. It can spin out of control, and you can come up with some pretty terrible things. But I mean, it's also just great fun. There's some that don't work, or some that work better than others, but I think it's always worth playing around with. So the idea that sort of stuck in my head was the idea of a city over time. So I developed this concept. An old city in the standard urban form, largely vertical towers, was perhaps falling down, in this case, flooded. So you could say this is some kind of study on climate change or this and that. You can say that, but it could also just be, who knows? It could be just, that's what I'm drawing. That's what happened. I'm not trying to be overly preachy or political. What I'm trying to do is say that there's a vertical city below, and then I wanted to design a somewhat futuristic horizontal city above. So I have done other sketches, but what I'm doing is just another sketch of what I've sort of landed on as a composition and an idea. So I thought it would be fun to play around with the idea of this collision of vertical forms that are old and newer forms, horizontal forms that are new or newer or futuristic even. So yeah, you get built into this sort of idea, the whole concept of time. Past, present, future. Again, vertical versus horizontal. Water, sky versus more solid man-made objects. Warm and cool colors will come in later, but I'm thinking about those already. I'm starting, when I was sketching this earlier, thinking, yeah, I think there's something here. I did an earlier sketch of this, which I can show just to be transparent. And it's something like this, just on a piece of scrap paper I found. It's the same idea, vertical old city and the horizontal new city. The difference here is I used a horizontal format. I'm not 100% convinced that's not the way to go. I just somehow felt the vertical format would give me more to play with in terms of connections of tonality, dark and light, in terms of colors, cools and warms, but also just this initial idea, this whole idea of pulling the eye up through the painting. I really felt strongly I didn't want to abandon this initial idea. So although I think you could do an okay image in the horizontal, ultimately I rejected this as being a little too obvious, perhaps, or a little too pedestrian. I wanted this to look less picturesque, less pictorial is the right word, and more schematic, more impressionistic. So I did decide to go with a vertical format. I think overall, it'll help me tell the story I want to tell better. I'm reverse engineering this because I've already done the painting. So therefore, after I did these sketches, I also did a pretty maniacal, overly detailed line drawing, which I'm going to post as a still image after this video segment. But I think I think it's generally a bad idea to overdraw your drawings on the watercolor paper. In the case of this painting to come, I did overdraw it on purpose. I kind of wanted it to read more as a drawing, less as a painting, if that makes sense. And I wanted sort of a framework, a drawing-based framework upon which to hang a relatively light painting. So the line work will show through the final work, etc. I played around with this. I swapped this ultimately and had this to play up the horizontal forms a bit more. I decided not to have this vertical tower interrupt that horizontal span, but to have it pass through. I built in some smaller horizontal elements, bridges connecting these larger structures, and I just began to design the shapes. What I liked about the horizontal format was the fact that I could really emphasize this futuristic shape, which sort of took dominance over these big, older vertical. And I wasn't sure that was the way to go, but I did want a little bit more expression here. So in the final, you will see, I widened this out and I let it pass in front of this tower a bit more. I had a bridge coming in here with a doorway, or a cutout almost. I developed this whole series of struts that I wanted to look fairly informal and almost haphazard, but almost like a treehouse, another form I've been playing around with a lot this year. And also these add the struts at the diagonal add another sort of energy from the really tectonic horizontal versus vertical. These diagonal struts add, a sort of alternative energy to the whole painting. I thought it would be nice. Here I started to hint at maybe another horizontal block suspended up even forward. I did work that into the final drawing and painting, you'll see soon. And there, another thing I try to do in my paintings is play up a lot of a sense of depth. You never can forget that whatever you're drawing or painting is all on a flat sheet of two-dimensional paper. You've only got the 2 dimensions to work with, width and height. So anything we do on the page to help emphasize a sense of 3-dimensionality, depth, is at least worth thinking about. So I do these sketches as I talk about a lot, as sort of my visual diary. They're where I get my thinking done. I can plan out a painting, make changes as I think are needed, and just work out ideas. If I do this, and I do recommend people do sketches, and don't think about making nice drawings necessarily, but just ideas, jotted down ideas. They're just incredibly helpful. So when you take an idea and go to the painting version of it, again, a lot of your thinking is done. It's out of the way. So you can paint much more fluidly, more quickly, more intuitively, and I think with a greater sense of joy and freedom than you can if you don't. So what I think you can see is I'm trying to be true to my initial sketch idea, in that I'm trying to crowd all of the interest at the top of the vertical image and fade out everything as it comes down. I do want to play up the water a little bit, but in faint tones. I'll add some reflections, but I just don't want to make too much out of the water. This is the star of the show, the top of the painting. I want to get a nice rhythm of foreground, midground distance happening. So there'll be that sense of depth. And I want a very light, washed out, mysterious background, and a relatively crisp and more cleanly defined foreground. So I didn't do a lot more than this before I started the final drawing. I did a lot of design work on these, but I just made it all up. It's all just imaginary things, again, drawn from my visual memory bank. There's probably some bits of real buildings, or at least ideas from them, but these types of sketches, again, are just useful for positioning, compositional positioning of shapes, and designing the values. Again, this is my center of interest. Where the darkest dark of your paintings meet the lightest light, that is almost always where your eye of the viewer is going to go. So I know I want to save this as the lightest light, this horizontal band reading through. Also this one, although it will be much less contrasty, but in the distance this will be light. A little bit of light on these towers perhaps, but primarily I want dark on imagining a sun or light angle this way. So this will be quite dark. This will be dark, but I hope to make it sort of uplit and luminous. So not jet black, but dark. This will be quite dark, so my number 3 values, 3. And little bits of dark there, not so much back here. So I'll set up, I hope, a nice rhythm of dark, 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 reading through this way, and then light, light, a little bit of light there, mostly reading through in this band. Secondarily, a light band here. Much of the water will be number 2, mid-tone, 1s, light, 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 dark, 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 dark. again, the highest level of contrast right up here at the top. So hopefully this will look all misty, mysterious, not that defined. And all of the interest and contrast will pull the viewer's eye up to this. Anyway, I just wanted to walk you through my thinking process. Again, I can see from this, I think probably the vertical axis is the way to go, the vertical format, but maybe there's a little too much verticality, and I think I want a little bit more horizontality. So I will try to make those tweaks when I do the final drawing. But I kind of like where this is going. Again, it's very much in keeping with the theme of what I first came up with, what I jotted down after waking up, what I started to think about, looking up at various tall structures and how they make you feel and react, and then bringing all those ideas forward to a completely imaginary subject matter with, I hope, a lot of room for different narratives. I don't want to tell you all I'm thinking about this idea, but I would really like it if it inspired others to look at this and come up with their own stories, their own narratives, and then you can write me and tell me what you think. For those asking, I'm using a Stillman&Birn Sketchbook beta series, which I love, and I love these sketch pencils. These are made by Blackwing. The light ones are the Pearl Palominos, and the dark Palominos are very much softer and great at laying in fairly controlled but darker bits of value. I did have one of these, which I love, these fatter sketch pencils. A lot of people make these. This one is made by a German company, Werther. They have thicker leads that come in various softnesses. This is about a 6B. It's a great sketch pencil. And my old favorites, these Faber-Castell E-Motion pencils. It's about an HB lead in these, fairly soft. You don't have to sharpen them. And I take these a lot when I travel because, again, you don't have to sharpen them. They're lightweight, beautiful, fantastic pencils. So, okay, so that's it for my thinking phase. As I say, I'm going to show you the finished line drawing, and then I have a two-step video of the painting process. A narrative section where I start, and then a time-lapse section where I wrap it all up. But anyway, thanks so much. Stay in touch, guys, and let me know what you're working on. And thanks for your attention. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Well, as you can see, I started painting this, and I posted the finished line drawing in the earlier segment, which was, obviously, a little maniacal. Highly detailed and a lot of stuff going on, which is not the way I always do my paintings, of course. This is a different kind of painting, more of an idea-based painting, certainly more than a scenic painting or a painting of something, because this is something that doesn't exist. It's a fictional urban landscape, a fictional city. So I thought that it could handle sort of heavy-handed, if you will, but a more complete line drawing under as a framework. And then I wanted to hang the painting on it in a looser, more expressionistic way. It would be yet another one of the series of sort of contrasts that I'm trying to build into this work. Obviously, it's fictitious, as I say, so it's a painting with a narrative or a number of narratives, maybe. It could be about any number of things, really. But for me, to be honest, what I'm doing here is telling a sort of fanciful story of a city that might have once been, that's now underwater, a bit, flooded, and rather than the entire civilization moving away, what's happened is later, who knows how many years later, a secondary layer of city was built upon the ruins of the first, much like the seven cities of Rome, I guess. One civilization builds on the shoulders of another. That's really what this painting is about, but it's also in a sense about time, of course, past, future, contrasting. Obviously, compositionally, it's about the contrast between the vertical and the horizontal, again, the past and the future. Obviously, there'll be contrasts of dark and light, contrasts of cool and warm tones, any number of contrasts. It's always, as you know, those of you who are nice enough to follow my work know that it's a recurring theme in pretty much everything I do. The whole idea of contrasts or dialogue between opposite things meeting on the surface of the paper and finding some form of resolution, or in some cases, not finding it. It's the tension between two opposite things meeting that I think is the recurring theme in my work, and what it's not, of course, the only way to paint, but it's one of the ways that I like to explore more internal landscapes as well as real-world observation of actual sites, but always looking for the things that conflict and find a sort of a resolution or a comfortable place to live together on the surface of the paper. You can read into that any number of things if you wish about how I look at the world and look at people and relationships, etc. You wouldn't be wrong, but I'm not trying to be that heavy-handed in this. This is more of a whimsical look, but I mean, obviously you could also say it's a commentary on changing climate and rising sea levels and that sort of thing, but I'm not specifically making it about that. I'm making this painting just about the clash of time more than anything, and the main topic of the clash of opposites. So I want to leave the door open for anybody who looks at this work to read into it whatever they wish or not. It can just be, I hope, appreciated on its own merits as an image, but it could also, if you wish it to be a commentary or a story on any number of other topics, both large and small. Another contrast I'm trying to work into this painting is I'm having most of the information, if you will, much of the specificity and detail and contrast will be at the top of the painting, and I'm going to have it gradually fade away as it comes down. So there'll be, when it's finished, a contrast between ambiguity at the bottom and specificity at the top, light and dark too, little contrast, more wet and wet, fuzzier, softer edges down here, crisper, more defined edges up top. So that's yet another level of contrast I'll be going for. This will be a somewhat time-consuming painting, so I'm not going to do it all real time. I will paint a bit of it, and then I think I will finish it off in a time-lapsed way. And I filmed a preface for all this where I talk you through my setup sketch, my inspiration sketch, and then hopefully you'll get an interesting look at one way to approach painting. Again, as I'm always telling everybody and myself, there's no one right thing to paint, or certainly no one right way to paint. But this is just a look inside my feverish brain. So here you can see, although the base drawing is fairly even for me, it's uncharacteristically specific and detailed. And so I'm trying to paint it in a much looser, more impressionistic way, both because I think it will tell the story better, it'll make the story more open for interpretation, and also to build in yet another layer or level of contrast between the specific and the implied. To do that, I'm using this really rough Baohong Master's Choice watercolor paper. This is 300 gram, 140 pound, the rough surface. It's very highly textured, and I really quite like it because it allows for effects like these dry brush marks to allow for a lot of implied detail without actually painting it. These dry brush marks skipping over the surface of the paper add a texture and an ambiguity that you, I mean, you can get it in other ways, but this, just for the way I paint, it's an extremely useful surface that I've quite fallen in love with. So what I'm doing here is really not worrying too much about specific things or details, but I'm just allowing larger areas of wet, warm tones to blend organically with cool tones. And for that, I'm using primarily raw umber and cobalt blue. Just two nice off contrasts, a warm and a cool. When it gets darker, I'll be dropping in some of this violet tones and an imperial purple mixed with a little bit of neutral tint. These are all Daniel Smith pigments. Again, the specific colors don't matter too much. It's really the tonality I'm going for and the temperature contrast, the warm versus the cool and the dark versus the light. I do think we all often, I do this too, we tend to complicate our lives too much, if I can be philosophic, but we definitely complicate our paintings too much sometimes. I'm extremely guilty of it. But really, when you break it down, it often just comes down to, in a successful painting, a solid dialogue between shapes and between values and between temperatures. So a solidly composed image of shapes, well-composed value study, which I showed earlier, and darks and lights. And then, generally speaking, a very simple dialogue between warm and cool tones will serve you very well. There are colorists, people who are far better, are more sophisticated, I suppose, at color than I. Don't think I'm bad, but I don't think my sense of color in a painting is necessarily, again, the most sophisticated. I concentrate far more on values. I'm not trying to downplay what I do. I'm just saying my interest is primarily in values. And as I say in my teachings, the hierarchy of things I concentrate on in my work are four. When I'm designing a painting, there are four major considerations. The idea or the intent has to be the main goal. What is it you're trying to paint and why? Nobody can really tell you that, of course. That's up to you to decide. But why did you decide to do the painting in the first place? The intent of the painting has to rule everything else. Once you have your intent, your intention, then you can start to compose elements that are appropriate to that intention, that'll make that intention come alive. I could talk for days on that topic, but generally, yes. In order to get there, in order to make a solid composition, Then you have to think about the values of your painting, the darks, the lights, and the midtones. All of my work is built up as a series of 3 basic values: light, dark, and midtones. I went through that a bit in my the sketch earlier, but just to reiterate. And then last, not least, but last for me, color. For me, there is no color in the world, however beautiful, that can save a painting that doesn't have a solid communicative sense of value. And so in general, to reiterate, for me, the color in a painting has to be in service to the values. The values have to be in service to the overall composition, and the composition has to be in service to the intent. So it's color, value, composition, and intent. And for me, if I get all of those nailed, or at least close, and in that specific order, then my painting has a better chance of being a success than if I don't. I look back at my older work often and criticize it. I'm fond of doing that. And I would say where I think a lot of my older work fell a little short was generally a muddled sense of values. I didn't have strong enough darks or light enough lights to really set up a dialogue and a narrative on the painting that I like to have. I'm honored to be asked to jury a lot of art shows, and I don't want to be preachy, but I would say, at least in my opinion, where I think often painters go a little off course is their technique can be beautiful, their intent can be clear and compelling, but if there is not in the final work a solid value design and composition, the work just looks flat and muddled and muddied often, and falls short. So yeah, for me, it's all about values. Colors to me enhance values, and colors of course carry value, but the sense of values to me is far more important almost always than any specific color. I'm not against color. I'm not at all against it. I just think, again, it has to be in service to values. For me, color in a work carries the emotional weight. Values in a work tend to carry more successfully the narrative weight or the intention. So they all play together. None of them are unimportant, but yeah, values have to be solid, or whatever color you use really won't matter that much. So you can see what I'm doing here is I'm just with a series of primarily flats, a larger 3/4 inch Escoda and a smaller 1/2 inch. I'm just sort of scraping in some tone on these old falling down buildings of yesteryear. What I'm trying to do is there's a series of 3 main shapes here, obviously. So, and also modulating the values helps establish depth and perspective in your painting. So if the darker, more higher contrast elements happen in what you want to look as the foreground of your painting often, that helps the more washed out tones of the distant objects to appear in a dimensional register. So that's a little easy trick you can play in perspective. Things that are far away tend to look more washed out, tend to have softer, less distinct edges. Things that are closer are going to have higher contrast, darker values, and crisper edges. Of course, there's a jillion exceptions to that. It's not a rule, but often that's just one little trick you can easily play to help set up depth in your painting. So I have this big, huge underside here, obviously, One thing I'm going for in this painting is to try to have the atmosphere, the sky behind, largely in cooler tones, and the older man-made objects, the older city, largely in dominant, warmer tones as yet another contrast. These new buildings I've invented, spanning across in the horizontal plane, I think I'm going to make them largely glassy in nature, so they will be blues and greens primarily to sort of belong to the atmosphere a bit more and to set them apart a bit from the heavier warm tones of the concrete and stone and steel buildings that are crumbling beneath. It'll just be, I think, yet another level of contrast. This side of the more forward hovering building, I want to keep it as light as I can. So I'm going to not paint it at all until probably very near the end and see what it needs. But I know that I need to save the light. You can always take light away, but it's hard to bring it back once it's gone. So I have an overall color plan for this, as I just described, but you know, there's room within that there may be some changes and some shifts. Time will tell. But generally speaking, I want it to be, because it's such a complex drawing, I really do want the color scheme to be fairly straightforward and simple, because there's a lot going on in this painting, this drawing, and I want the painting then to be a little bit more straightforward and easy to understand. This is just primarily a ultramarine blue. To modify it, I'll just drop in a little bit of, this is a Van Dyke brown, or sepia, sorry. But anyway, just a darker, warm tone, just so it's not too insistently blue. These are a series of small Escoda Perla series of brushes I use. They're synthetic rounds, and they don't hold as much water as the natural brushes, but they keep their shape, hold a beautiful point, and allow for more slightly detailed work such as this. Just in here, inside of this big overhanging window, I'm dropping in a little bit of permanent orange to contrast, to complement all of the blue. No need to get too fancy, but this area here is, in a sense, the star of the show, this whole area really, where the darkest dark of your painting is going to meet the lightest light. That's where the viewer's eye is most likely going to land when they first look at your work. So that's sort of where you want to put your time and effort if you're going to think about it in that way. If you want to orchestrate where the viewer's eye goes, if you create an area of highest contrast, that's precisely where the viewer's eye is going to go first. And that's maybe something you want to do and maybe something you want to avoid. Depends on the painting entirely. In this case, I really want to raise the eye and spirit, if you will, of the viewer up. If I'm trying to tell a story, I was trying to avoid explaining this, and nobody asked, but what I'm trying to do is create a fictional city above the ruins of an old one. So that could be a very grim, sad story, and I don't want it to be. I want there to be a sense of hope and future and advancement, not just of death and destruction and the end of all things. I want to try to tell a story without preaching about how we carry on and there's something after. whatever that may be. So in that sense, if you can orchestrate the viewer's eye and hopefully their spirit and imagination by pulling it up, the vertical composition helps do that, but also keeping all the contrast and most of the interest at the top of the painting, you're going to naturally pull the viewer's eye up. And I think overall, as if it were a piece of music, that's sort of a positive note or color that you as the artist can orchestrate. If I put all of the interest down here at the bottom, I think it would pull the eye and the spirit of the viewer down through the work and out the bottom, and I want really to raise the viewer's spirit up. I don't know how pretentious that sounds. I don't want it to sound pretentious. I don't mean it to. It's, if I'm just being honest, those are the kind of things that run through my mind when I'm planning and designing a painting. As I say, I'm always trying my best not to paint pictures of things, but I'm trying to paint pictures about things. Rather than paint a scene, I would rather paint a feeling or an emotion or an experience. So I don't think that goal is pretentious. The outcome could be, but I don't think it has to be. I think it's just what interests me. And so I wouldn't be true to myself if I didn't try to explore that and make the most out of it. All that said, I'm not entirely sure what colors are best to use on the underside of this big overhanging city. I want there to be a sense of some light underneath, not just dark and gloomy and shadowy, but also to, to keep it in the spirit of the painting. In general, I want a sense of uplift and optimism. So I want to have some bounce light under this giant structure. So since this is water, it's not impossible to imagine that there would be light bouncing off the surface of that water and illuminating the underside of this overhanging structure a bit. So I don't want to overthink it, which I always do. So anyway, I'm painting it not as dark as you might think it would be. And I may go back and darken it. I hope I nail it first time, but my instinct says that it wants to be a little less dark than you think, and a little bit luminous. Anyway, that's sort of mostly raw umbers, a little bit of orange, and a bit of cobalt blue just to contrast. And I'm dropping in just a little bit more orange on the leading edge. Hopefully don't overdo it, which I've been known to do with this color because I love it. But I think it will dry nicely and give a sense of illumination without any kind of gloomy, shadowy, ominous foreboding. Yeah, that's okay. It's not bad. There'll be other stuff coming. There are some structure under here which I can either delineate with some dry brush later as this dries or not. I'm not sure how much it needs. There are these large struts that come down that will be, I'm sure they will be delineated in some way. Time will tell how I manage that. Before that dries, I want to pull it down into a shadow against this older vertical structure. And I think I want to toggle that warmish glow into a sort of a duskier violet tone to create the shadow and then the shade in part on this side. I want to work rather quickly because I don't want this to dry too quickly and leave funky marks. Although a few funky marks wouldn't be so bad, but I'm trying to keep them to a minimum. Yeah, I want to keep the really dark tones probably here and a little bit here. So I want these to be darker, but not the darkest, because this, of course, assembly is more in the midground and going into the distance. So I don't want too much contrast over here. Then I'll just drag some of that violet down over the shade side of this old building. Fading everything out before it reaches the water because I want the sense of uplighting. And I also want the entire painting, as I said, to fade out a bit as it all comes down. So far so good. I'm generally happy with that look. I'm generally happy with this. Again, I've got to connect that, but I'm really not happy with what's going on here. It looks a little too specific and not very elegant. So I'll soften out some of those lines and connect some of that and just add some character marks, some sense of these deep insets, windows and things that I've invented. Great thing about painting scenes or cities or landscapes that you've invented is nobody can tell you if they're right or wrong, because they're yours. So you can make them anything you want. So I'm going away from the violet way down here and using just some raw umber or whatever was in my palette, just a warmer, lighter tone to just imply some of the architectural detail without getting too specific about any of it. Yeah, I think for now that's plenty. I'm starting to stress about this, so I'm going to go back up there and try to finish that out and bring it over into this. I love this paper, but it has some qualities to bear in mind if you're tempted to try it, which I hope you do. But it's fairly soft, so you can't do a lot of glazing on it. It's better if you can get the values pretty much right and the color right the first time, because if you go back and glaze over anything, you can do it, but not as easily as on arches or another paper that has perhaps more sizing in. So you have to just bear that in mind. And you can't do a lot of lifting very successfully or any of those techniques. So it is a bit of a challenging, difficult paper in some ways to work on. And of course, that's why I like it, because I love a challenge. So here, I've finished out the underside of this portion of the overhanging city structure that I've invented. I don't know about that. It's okay. Looks a little Jetsons. And before that dries, I'm going to connect it up to what's happening here, the darker side of this more foreground tower. This is just sepia. Again, the color here is not too important. It's really just the value at this point. What I'm trying to do is avoid a line drawing there. I want the shadow, the shade to connect to the shadow, or the shade. Anyway, yes, I want this to all read as one shape, not all distinct different things. So I'll go back to some of this violet, a little bit more saturated, a little bit darker than I used over there. It's not a great deal different, but it is a little bit more, a little less watered down. Same effect though. I'm scraping it down as it comes near the bottom because I want to keep this as luminous and light as I can for now. Again, in watercolor you can always take away light, but it's pretty hard to add it once it is gone. So here I'm trying to imply some blown out corners and fallen down bits of this tower. I got pretty carried away with myself, I admit. Such a fun thing to draw. I love drawing, and there's certainly nothing wrong with drawing, but if ultimately you're painting it, it's a risk that you can run, that I run all the time, of overdrawing, doing too much drawing, and then it gets to a point where you think, I should have just left it as a drawing. It doesn't really need color. So I was treading this line with this painting. I wanted it to be a painting, but a sort of a light painting over a heavier drawing, which is atypical, not standard, but I like it when it works. It just doesn't always. It can sometimes just look too tight and too technical, and that's the last thing I want. I'm really hoping this painting, when finished, looks suggestive and poetic more than technical. So generally I'm happy with this. I think there's enough ambiguity there. You can start to sense what's going on without everything being spelled out exactly. And overall, general registry of values from lightest lights to darkest darks here are starting to toggle nicely into the distance where things get more washed out and less saturated there. I'm going to finish out much of the painting now in a time-lapsed way to attach it to this, but sad for you, there'll be no voiceover, so I can't give you my dialogue while I'm doing that. But this will be a time-consuming thing, so I'm going to do that now and splice the two together.